Public sector banks, incidentally, are the ones which which have the onus and the responsibility of lending to sectors which are not the most profitable, not the most glamorous, which private sector banks would keep as top priority. Especially when it comes to companies of middle and small sizes. That's where you find credit availability so difficult, especially from private banks. And the public sector banks are the ones who are supposed to sort of make up for the loss, make up for the gap over there. And now you have banks being told that they need to relook at their rejection of loan from loans from MSMEs. MSMEs wanting loans and banks rejecting them, because it's very clear the data suggests, Kartik, that banks are extremely overcautious to the point of not giving enough at all whatsoever in terms of loan and credit to MSMEs.
You're right, Krishna. And I mean, no guidance really issued by RBI to help the MSME sector derive more loans. But let's look at the data which has come from SIDBI and TransUnion CIBIL. And it very clearly indicates that banks today are very, very wary of lending to MSMEs. Why? It seems because they want to keep their books pristine. They don't want to encounter an NPA situation, a ballooning NPA situation, where there are defaults and a possibility of no recovery of the loans that they shell out to these MSMEs. What is conversely happening also, before we come to the data, is that MSMEs are finding it very hard to leverage themselves at competitive rates. So if banks are not opening their lending taps to MSMEs, they are forced to go to NBFCs. They are forced to go to private lenders outside of the banking environment and raise capital at a much higher rate, which overall is not great for the health of an economy which is expected to grow at 7.6% or should grow at 7.6% to become the third largest economy. So that is the broad context. Now let's look at the data. MSME loans, the demand for these loans has grown up 33% between FY22 and FY23, the last quarter, Q4. The demand is up 33%, but the disbursement of loans is up only 11%, which means while there's been a third of the demand added, only a third of that is being serviced. So 1/6 is the growth in the credit offtake when it comes to 1/9, in fact, when it comes to banks giving this credit or denying this credit to MSMEs. Now, again, the data suggests that there has been, by way of this, an improvement in the asset quality of the banks. And they want to continue with this asset quality and this, declining loans to keep their NPAs off their books. And that is beginning to show in their books, because unpaid loans have been reduced considerably from 2.9% to 2.4% in the same period. So 50 basis points there is not a small number, right?
Absolutely
so 2.4%. Now, on an average, the borrowing from the MSMEs, especially in the plus 1 CR plus loan category, has seen a major decline. And the ticket size for PSBs lending to MSMEs has reduced by about a fifth or so, right? So it's down about 21%. Whereas private banks have been a little more risk friendly in that sense, and the decline from private banks lending to MSMEs has been a little low at just about 7% or so.
Right, those figures telling a fascinating story over there. Public sector banks, the panacea for lending to sectors who don't get credit, using the maximum downfall in the 20%. Kartik, I have a strange analogy that came to my mind as you were describing this. This feels like schools which don't want average performing students, so that their final percentage for 10th and 12th public is really up. I'm not going to have you in my school because my overall percentage goes on. I want only 90% plus students in my school, so that my school is seen as that 90%
Krishna,
school.
You're right. And I have always, as a student, and I haven't been a very bright one, I've always dealt with this conundrum that why do you have an admission test to come into schools? And if you do have an admission test, the kid who has scored the lowest should be given the first admission, because that is the guy who definitely needs better education.
If you are such a good school, you should be able to educate that
kid. Average, that guy definitely needs an education. The brighter guy can learn, has enough knowledge already.
Right. If anybody needs credit, MSMEs need credit similarly. And then you have the institutions of the biggest of institutions meant for that. Public sector banks are meant to help these MSMEs out, because they are not there on the wild, crazy, profit-mongering run that private banks are.
Absolutely. So, and I think, the blue chip companies, the Nifty 50 large cap companies have enough and more avenues. And for them, even if the cost of capital goes up by 20 basis points, 50 basis points, they will very well be able to afford it, because they play with those margins. in the case of MSMEs, what happens when these funding or lending taps dry out? They become absolutely dependent on much higher costs of capital and then run the risk of shutting down, run the risk of making losses, which doesn't augur well for a sector which employs almost a quarter of India's workforce.
Right. Another thing that came to mind recently, a company called Shriram Group came out with its results. Fantastic results. Shriram Finance, we're talking about a company that made it a point to give out loans without collateral. And at that point in time, when Shriram Group, from Chennai came up, the question that was asked was, why are you going to do a business but without giving collateral? They're not going to repay you. Your business is never going to grow. Guess what? Their repayments are extremely high. That strata of society that Shriram Group lends to, that their repayment levels are very high. It's a business that does very well. It gives credit to the underserved, those who don't get credit, those who don't get loan, and as a standing example in this country of people. It's not even MSMEs. MSMEs are registered companies. They're just small. You're talking about individuals without collateral getting loan and them, paying back. So there is a lesson to be learned of, MSMEs, I'm sure their repayment percentage is way higher.
I mean, it's a great story in trust management. Yes. I still believe that, as a student of economics, I believe that credit worthiness still needs to be gauged.
Okay.
Right. So you gauge your credit worthiness. Now, with or without collateral, that is a separate debate. But credit worthy MSMEs who have not defaulted, who do not have a history of default, should not be denied credit by banks just because they want to assure their investors and their board that their books are going to be clean.
Right. So that's one story as far as banks being cautious of MSMEs is concerned.